everyone, and welcome to another edition of Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad that you're here with us wherever you may be. Hope the day's going well. And we have Erin Edgar on our episode today. Edgar is a very interesting person in a lot of ways. She's a caring, heart-centered attorney. She is also an inspirational speaker and a vocal artist. I'm not sure whether vocal artistry comes into play when she's in the courtroom, but we won't worry about that too much. I assume that you don't sing to your judges when you're trying to deal with something. But anyway, I'll let her answer that. I'm just trying to cause trouble. But Erin, we're really glad you're with us. We really appreciate you being here. And I know you do a lot with estate planning and other kinds of things that'll be fun to talk about. So welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here. And I haven't sung in a courtroom or a courthouse yet, but I wouldn't rule it out.
I have someone who I know who also has a guide dog, and his guide dog, it's been a while since I've seen him, but his guide dog tended to be very vocal, especially at unexpected times. And he said that occasionally happened in the courtroom, which really busted up the place.
Oh, dear. I imagine that would draw some smiles. Hopefully smiles.
Yeah. Well, they were. They were. Do you appear in court much?
No, the type of law that I practice, I don't think I've ever appeared in court after I've written people's wills, but I have done previous things where I was in court mediating disputes, which is a separate thing that I used to do. So I've been in court, just not recently.
Yeah. Well, that's understandable. Well, let's start a little bit with the early Erin, growing up and all that sort of stuff. Tell us about that.
Sure. So I was born in cold, gray Indiana. Oof. And chilly in the wintertime. And I started out, I was blind from birth, so my parents thought it would be a good idea to send me to the school for the blind for a while. And back when I was born, umpteen years ago, they did not mainstream visually impaired and disabled students in that state, so you went where you could. And I was at the blind school until I reached third grade. And then we moved to Georgia, and I've been in the South ever since. I live in North Carolina now. And I started going to public schools in fourth grade and continued on that route all the way up through high school.
Ah, okay. And so then what did you do?
So after that, I was one of those high school students. I really wanted to get out of Dodge and leave my high school behind. I went visiting a couple of colleges in Georgia, and I said to my parents, I really don't like this. It's like going to high school again. Literally, I was meeting people I had been in high school with. And I decided and was very grateful that my parents were able to rig it some way so that I could go to an out-of-state school, and I went to UNC Chapel Hill here in North Carolina. Tar Heels all the way. And I was there for undergrad, and then I got into law school there as well, which I was very excited about because I didn't have to go anywhere, and graduated from law school again a while ago in the early 2000s.
Okay. And so then you went straight into law from that?
I didn't. I did some other things before I actually went into law itself. I worked with some local advocacy organizations, and I also mediated, as I said earlier, I did mediations with the county court, helping mediate criminal disputes. And we're talking about like things with you get in a dispute with your neighbor and you yell at each other, those kind of people's court type things. They were fun and interesting. And then I did go into law after that. I started working with Legal Aid of North Carolina, which is an organization that helps people in poverty who cannot afford a lawyer to go and have their options communicated to them and some help given to them regarding their public benefits or certain other, public things that we could help with. We weren't able to help with any personal injury or, any of the fun stuff you see on TV. So, and then when the pandemic hit, I started my own law practice and completely changed gears and went into writing estate plans and wills for a living.
Do you think that your time doing mediation work and so on taught you a lot about humanity and human nature and people?
It did.
I'll bet it did.
It was invaluable, actually, in that area. Taught me a lot about, I don't know necessarily about human nature. However, it did teach me a lot about how to talk to people who were on different pages. They had perhaps values and principles that weren't quite the same, or they had a different way of looking at the same exact situation, and how to bring those people together and allow them to connect on a deeper level rather than the argument. We're able to get them to agree to kind of move forward from that. So nobody has to be found guilty.
Right.
And, a judge you don't have to drag a criminal conviction around with you. I think the most rewarding cases that I had by far were the education cases, because I don't know if anyone knows this, but in most states in the United States, if you don't send your kids to school, you are guilty of a crime. It's called truancy, and you can be arrested. Well, the county that I live in was very forward thinking, and the school system and the court said, that's kind of dumb. We don't want to arrest parents if their kids aren't going to school. There's something behind it. The school's not providing what the child needs. The child's acting out for some reason, and we need to get to the bottom of it. So what they did was they set up a process whereby we could come in as neutral observers. We did not work for the court. We were part of a separate organization, and have a school social worker there or counselor, and also have a parent there, and they could talk through the issues. And in a lot of cases, if the children were old enough, they were teenagers, they were there and they could talk about it from their perspective. And truly amazing things came out of those situations. We would discover that the children had a behavioral issue or even a disability that had not been recognized, and we're able to come up with plans to address that with, or the school was with our help.
Mm-hmm. Going back a little bit, how did your parents deal with the fact that you were blind? I gather it was a fairly positive experience.
For me, it was positive. I was so fortunate, and I'm still so grateful to this day for having parents who were very forward-thinking and advocated for me to have and do not whatever I wanted, because I was far from spoiled, but whatever,
that,
but whatever, however I wanted to be successful, they advocated for me. And so my mother actually told me, when I was born, they went through all the parent things like, oh gosh, what did we do wrong? Why is God punishing us? All that. And they very early on found support groups for, parents with children with either blindness or disabilities of some sort. And that was a great source of help to them. And as I grew up, they made every effort to ensure that I had people who could teach me, if they couldn't, how to interact with other children. Mm-hmm. I think for a while when I was very little, and I actually kind of remember this, they hired an occupational therapist to come and teach me how to play with kids, because not only was I blind, but I was an only child. So I didn't have brothers and sisters to interact with.
I was
And
going to
that whole
ask you
play
about
thing
that.
was kind of a mystery to me.
Yeah.
And I remember it sort of vaguely, but that's just a demonstration that they wanted me to have the best life possible and to be fully integrated into the sighted world as much as possible. So when I was at the blind school and I was in this residential environment, and there was an added bonus that my parents didn't really weren't happy in their jobs either, and they weren't happy with the education I was getting. That they decided, well, we're just going to pick up and move. And that was, quite frankly, as I look back on it now, a huge risk for them. And they did it, 50% for me and 50% for them, maybe even 60-40. But as I look back on it now, it's another demonstration of how supportive they were. And all the way through my school age years, were very active in ensuring that I had everything that I needed and that I had the support that I needed.
That's cool. How did it go when you went to college at UNC?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, a very good question.
You didn't
So,
play basketball, I assume,
oh
so I figure
no,
you had
I
other things
didn't.
to do.
Yeah, I had other stuff to do. I sang in the choir and sang with the medieval chorus group and, all this other like musical
Hmm.
geeky stuff. And when we were looking for colleges and universities, one of the criteria was they had to have a solid kind of like disability slash visually impaired center or, support staff that would help in, allow people with disabilities to go through the university. So at UNC Chapel Hill, they had, as part of their student affairs department, disability services, and it just so happened that they were very aware of accommodations that blind people needed. I wasn't the first blind student to go through
Hmm.
undergrad there. That's not law school, that's undergrad. And so, how much was it? Time and a half on tests if I was doing them on the computer, double time if I was doing them in Braille. A lot of the tests were in Braille because they had the technology to do it. And also the gentleman who ran the disability services department, I think, knew Braille, if I'm not mistaken,
Oh,
and could transcribe if necessary. But I was at the stage at that point where I was typing most of my exams anyway, um, and didn't need much that was in Braille because I had books either electronically, or they had a network of folks in the community that would volunteer to read if there was not, available textbooks from RFD and what is it? RFB&D.
RP&D, now Learning
It was
Ally,
at the
yeah.
time. Yeah, now Learning Ally. There wasn't a Bookshare at that time, so we couldn't use Bookshare. But if there weren't textbooks available, they would have people in the community who would read them for them, and they would get paid a little bit. Now, when I went to law school, it was a totally different ballgame because I was the first law student who was blind that UNC Chapel Hill had, and it was a different school within the school. So
Hmm.
that student affairs department was not part of the law school anymore. And we had quite a time the first semester getting my books in a format that I could read them in. They did eventually kind of broker a deal, if you will, with the publishers who were either Thomson Reuters or Westlaw at the time,
Yeah.
to get electronic versions. They were floppy disks. This is how old I am. Floppy disks. They were in this weird format. I think it was WordPerfect or something,
Yeah,
usually.
probably
Uh,
was.
it was. And
Because they didn't really have a lot of the newer, well,
no, they
what
didn't
are
have,
now newer publishing
there
systems. So yeah.
wasn't, yeah, there wasn't PDF even, I don't think, at the time. And the agreement was I could get those, and I actually had to buy the print textbooks as well. So I have this whole bookcase of law books that are virgin, unopened almost, and they're, some of them almost 25 years old, never been opened, and of no use to anyone.
Yeah.
But I have them, and they look nice sitting over
Yeah.
there in that
They're
bookshelf.
antique books.
They're antiques. So the first year was a little rough because for a while I didn't have books. And we were able to make arrangements so that I could kind of make up some classes on a later year and switch things around a little bit. And it ended up all working out really well once we got started.
Yeah. I remember when I was going through and getting my bachelor's and master's in physics, I needed the books in Braille because
Ooh.
it's the only way to be able to really deal with the subject. You can't do it
Mm-hmm.
nearly as well from recordings, although now there's a little bit better capability through recording because we have the DAISY format and so on. But still, it's not the same as reading it in Braille. And
Mm-hmm.
for mathematics and physics and so on, I think that the only way to really do it is in Braille. And we had challenges because professors didn't want to decide what books to use until the last minute because they said, oh,
Mm-hmm.
a new book might be coming out and we want to get the latest book. And that didn't work for me
Right.
because I had a network that in part I developed, but the Department of Rehabilitation out here helped. Our Office for Disabled Students didn't really have the resources to know it. They were very supportive. They just
Mm-hmm.
didn't really deal with it. But the bottom line is that we had I had to develop the network of transcribers, but they needed 3 to 6 months to do the books, at least three
I'll
months
bet.
and sometimes I would get them 1 or 2 volumes at a time, and they barely kept ahead of the class. But it worked. But professors resisted it,
I
and
bet.
my the person who ran the Office for Students with Disabilities said, "Look, you have to work on these things, but if you're not getting cooperation from professors, then you come and tell me,
Mm-hmm.
and I will use the power of this office to get you what you need." There's another thing you might consider doing, she said.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "What's that?" And Jan said, "Go meet the chancellor, make friends. It's good to
Yeah.
have friends in high places." And so I did. And Dan
Oh, there you
Aldrich and I
go.
became pretty good friends over the years, which was pretty cool.
It was weird because I didn't have that problem with the professors. They were, I had a couple of old codgers, but they weren't really worried about the books. They were fine with me having the books, but it was the publishers. The publishers were
Yeah.
irritated that I needed them in an alternative format. And I didn't really, I was not, I was one of those people that if someone said they were going to do something for me, I kind of let people do it. And at the time, I was really not an advocator for myself at that time, a very good self advocate. And so I kind of let the school interface with that. I think it would have been really interesting if I look back on it for me to have taken a hand in that. And I
Mm-hmm.
wonder what would have happened. Well, and at this point, it's neither here nor there. But that's really fascinating, making friends with the chancellor. Sometimes
Yeah.
you have to do stuff like that.
Well, and the idea was really to get to know him, and there
Hmm.
were obviously other motivations, like if we needed to go to a higher court to get help, we could go to the
Right.
chancellor. I never had to do that, but the reason for meeting him and getting to know him was really just to do it and to have fun doing
Sure.
it. And
And
so we did.
yeah, and I kind of had a comparable experience. I met the dean of the law school
Mm,
for that very reason. And he said, if you've got trouble, come to me. My parents got involved a little bit, and we all, met together and maybe even separately at some points just to make sure that I had everything that I needed at various times. And I made friends with some of the assistant deans at the law school in particular because of this situation, and one of whom was the dean of the law school student affairs, who was helping me to get what I needed.
mm,
And for a while, when I was in law school and beyond, he was like, we lent books to each other. It was very
mm-hmm.
funny. We found out we had the same reading tastes beyond law books. It
There you
wasn't,
go.
legal at all, but we were like trading books and things. So a lot of really good relationships came out
Yeah.
of that.
And I think that's extremely important to do. And I think that's one of the things that offices for students with disabilities that tend to want to do everything for you. I think
Mhm.
that's one of the things that's a problem with those offices, because if you don't learn to do them, and if you don't learn to do them in college, how are you going to be able to really act independently and as an advocate after college. So you have to learn that stuff.
Absolutely. That's a very good point.
So I I think it was extremely important to do it, and we did, and had a lot of fun doing it. So it was
Mhm.
good. What are some of the biggest misconceptions you think that people had about you as a blind child growing up?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. I think that one of the biggest misconceptions that people had about me, especially when I was younger, is that I would be sort of relegated to staying at home with parents all of my life, or being a stay-at-home parent, and not able to be kind of professionally employed and
Yeah,
earning a living wage. Now, I have my own business, and that's where most of my money goes at this point. So, earning a living wage might be up in the air at the moment. Ha ha. But the one thing I think that the biggest misconception that people had, and this is even like teachers at the blind school, it was very rare for blind children of my age to grow up and be, you know, professionals in, I don't want to say high places, but like able to support themselves without a government benefit backing
yeah,
them up. And it was kind of always assumed that we would be in that category, that we would be less able than our sighted peers to do that. And so that was a huge misconception, even in the
yeah,
school that I was attending. I think that was really the main one. And one misconception that I had then and still have today is that if I'm blind, I can't speak for myself.
hmm,
This still happens today. For instance, if I want if I'm going somewhere and I just happen to be with someone sighted, they will talk, wherever I'm at, they will talk to the sighted person,
right. They won't
not
talk to
me.
you.
They won't talk to me. And so, for instance, simple example, if I'm somewhere with my husband and we happen to be walking together and we go somewhere that I need to go, they will talk to him because he's guiding me, and they won't talk. And he's like, don't talk to me. I have no idea, talk to her. And part of that is I'm half a step behind him. People naturally gravitate to the people that are
Hmm.
leading. However, I noticed even when I was a young adult and I would go, to the doctor, and I would be with my parents, like maybe I'm visiting them and I need to go to the doctor. They would talk to them and not me,
Yeah,
which is kind of sad. And I think it happens a lot more than people realize.
yeah, it does. And one of my favorite stories is this. I got married in 1982, and
Mm-hmm.
my wife has always been, or had always been, she passed away in 2022, but she was always in a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to a restaurant one Saturday for breakfast. We were standing at the counter waiting to be seated, and the hostess was behind the counter, and nothing was happening. And finally, Karen said to me, she doesn't know who to talk to, because Karen, of course, is in a wheelchair. So actually, she's clearly shorter than this person behind the counter. And then there's me, and of course, I'm not making eye contact. And so
Mm-hmm.
Karen just said she doesn't know who to talk to. I said, all she's got to do is ask us where we would like to sit, or if we'd like to have
Mm-hmm.
breakfast, and we can make it work. Well, she got the message, and she did, and the rest of the day went fine. But that was really kind of funny that we had two of us, and
Oh
she just
yeah.
didn't know how to deal with either of us, which was kind of cute.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
That's cute.
it brings up another question. Um, and you used the term earlier, visually impaired. There's been a lot of effort over the years. A lot of the professionals, if you will, created this whole terminology of visually impaired, and they say, well, you're blind or you're visually impaired, and visually impaired means you're not totally blind, but you're still visually impaired.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, blind people, I think, are starting to realize what people who are deaf learned a long time ago. And that is that if you take a deaf person and you refer to them as hearing impaired, there's no telling what they might do to you because they recognize that impaired is not true and they shouldn't be equated with people who have all of their hearing. So it's deaf or hard of hearing, which is a whole lot less of an antagonistic sort of concept than hearing impaired. We're starting to get blind people, and not everyone's there yet. And we're starting to get agencies, and not every agency is there yet, to recognize that it's blind or low vision as opposed to blind or visually impaired.
Or visually impaired.
What do you think about that? And how does that contribute to the attitudes that people had toward you?
Yeah. So when I was growing up, I was handicapped. Ew.
Yeah, there was that too. Yeah.
Yeah, that I was never fond of that. And my mother softened it for me by saying, well, we all have our handicaps or our shortcomings, but it was really what was meant was you had something that really held you back. I actually, I say, this is so odd. I usually say I'm totally blind. Because when I say blind, the immediate question people have is, how blind are you?
Yeah, which gets back to the other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're blind, in my opinion, if you're blind, you're blind. And if you have low vision, you have partial sight. And visually impaired used to be the term, when I was younger that people would use. And that's
still used a lot.
It's still used a lot. And I will use it occasionally. Generally, I think that partially sighted, I have partial vision is what I've heard people use. That's how my husband refers to himself. Low vision is also, all those terms are much less pejorative than actually being impaired.
Right. That's kind of really the issue.
Yeah.
Well, my favorite example of all of this is a past president of the National Federation of the Blind, Ken Jernigan. You've heard of him, I assume.
Oh, sure.
He created a document once called A Definition of Blindness. And his definition, he goes through and discusses various conditions, and he asks people if you meet these conditions, are you blind or not? But then what he eventually does is he comes up with a definition. And his definition, which I really like, is you are blind if your eyesight has decreased to the point where you have to use alternatives to full eyesight in order to function, which takes into account totally blind and partially blind people, because the reality is that most of those people who are low vision will probably, or they may probably, lose the rest of their eyesight. And the agencies have worked so hard to tell them, just use your eyesight as best you can. And, you may need to use a cane, but use your eyesight as best you can. And if you go blind, then we're going to have to teach you all over again, rather than starting by saying blindness is really okay. And the reality is that if you learn the techniques now, then you can use the best of all worlds.
I would agree with that. I would also say people should use what they have.
Yeah.
Using everything you have is okay. And I think there's a lot of good to be said for learning the alternatives while you're still able to rely on something else.
Point taken, exactly.
Because as you age, you get more and more in the habit of doing things one way, and it's very hard to break out of that. And if you haven't learned an alternative, you feel like there's nothing to fall back on.
Right.
And it's even harder because now you're in the situation of urgency where you feel like you're missing something and you're having to learn something new. Whereas if you already knew it, and knew different ways to rely on things, you would be just like picking a memory back up rather than having to learn something new. Well, I've never been in that position, so I can't say, but in the abstract, I think that's a good definition.
Well, there are a lot of examples. Like, take a person who has some eyesight, and they're not encouraged to use a cane. And I know of someone who was in this situation. I think I've told the story on this podcast, but he lived in New Jersey and was traveled every day from New Jersey into Philadelphia to work. And he was on a reasonably cloudy day, was walking along. He had been given a cane by the New Jersey Commission for the Blind, but they didn't really stress the value of using it. And so he was walking along the train to go in, and he came to the place where he could turn in and go into the car, and he did, and promptly fell between two cars because he wasn't at the right place. And then the train actually started to move, but they got it stopped, and so he was okay. But as he tells the story, he certainly used his cane from then on, because if he had been using the cane, even though he couldn't see it well because it was dark or not light enough, he would have been able to see that he was not at the place where the car entrance was, but rather he was at the junction between two cars. And there's so many examples of that. There's so many reasons why it's important to learn the skills. Should a partially blind or a low vision person learn to read Braille? Well, depends on circumstances, of course, I think to a degree, but the value of learning Braille is that you have an alternative to full print, especially if there is a likelihood that you're going to lose the rest of your eyesight. If you psychologically do it now, that's also going to psychologically help you prepare better for not having any eyesight later.
And of course, that leads to blind children these days learn how to read.
Yeah.
Which is another issue.
Which is another issue because educators are not teaching Braille nearly as much as they should, and the literacy rate is so low. And the fact of the matter is, even with George Kirscher, who invented the whole DAISY format and all the things that you can do with e-published books and so on, the reality is there is still something to be said for learning Braille. You don't have sighted children just watching television all the time, although sometimes their parents think they do. But the point is that they learn to read, and there's a value of really learning to read. I've been in an audience where a blind speaker was delivering a speech, and he didn't know or use Braille. He had a device. It was, I think what he actually used was a Victor Reader Stream, which is a
used
book
to
player.
Have one of those, right?
I think it was that. It may have been something else. But the bottom line is he had his speech written out, and he would play it through earphones, and then he would verbalize his speech.
Oh, no, that would just mess me up.
Oh, it would. It was very disjointed.
Ooh.
And I think that for me personally, I read Braille pretty well, but I don't like to read speeches at all. I want to engage the audience. And so it's really important to truly speak with the audience and not read or do any of those other kinds of things.
I would agree. Now, I do have a Braille display that I use, and, I do use it for speeches. However, I don't put the whole speech on there.
Me too. I have one, and I use it for, I have notes.
Notes.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Braille, especially for math, when you said math and physics, I'm like, yeah, I can't imagine doing math without Braille. That just doesn't, I can't imagine it. And especially in, geometry and trigonometry with those diagrams, I don't know how you would do it without a Braille textbook. But there's certainly something to be said for the wonderful navigation abilities with e-published audio DAISY books. However, it's not a substitute for knowing how to read.
Well, how are you going to learn to spell? How are you going to really learn sentence structure? How are you going to learn any of those basic skills that sighted kids get if you don't use Braille? And
absolutely.
I think that's one of the arenas where the educational system, to a large degree, does such a great disservice to blind kids because it won't teach them Braille.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, thank you for this wonderful spin down Braille reading lane here. That was fun.
Well, so getting back to you a little bit, you must have thought or realized that probably when you went into law, you were going to face some challenges. But what was the defining moment that made you decide you're going to go into law? And what kind of challenges have you faced, if you faced challenges? I'm making an assumption, but, whatever.
Oh, sure. So the defining moment when I decided I wanted to go into law, it was a very interesting time for me. I was a teenager don't know exactly how old I was, but I think I was in high school. And I had gone through a long period where I wanted to like be a music major and
Ah,
go into um, piano and voice and be a performer in those arenas and get a high level degree, whatnot. And then I began having this um, began becoming very interested in watching the Star Trek television series. Primarily, I was out at the time, The Next Generation. And I was always fascinated by the way that these people would find these civilizations on these planets, and they would be at odds in the beginning and they would be at each other's throats. And then by the end of the day, they were all kind of liking each other.
and Jean-Luc Picard learned to
Picard,
play a flute.
yes, and he also turned into a Borg, which was traumatic for me.
Yes, yes.
I had to wait the whole summer to figure out what would happen. I was in trauma. Anyway, my father and I bonded over that show. It was a wonderful sort of father-daughter thing. We did it every weekend, and I was always fascinated by like the whole aspect of different ideologies coming together. And it always seemed to me that that's what humanity should be about. As I, got older, I thought, how could I be involved in helping people come together? Oh, let's go into law because, our government's really good at that. That was the high school student in me.
Yeah.
And I thought at the time I wanted to go into the foreign service and work in the international field and help, on a foreign policy level. I quickly got into law school and realized two things simultaneously in my second year. International law was very boring, and there were plenty of problems in my local community that I could help solve. Like, why work on the international stage when people in my local community are suffering to some degree with something? And so I completely changed my focus to wanting to work in an area where I could bring people together and work on an individualized level. And as I went into the legal field, it was part of the reason I went into the mediation, because that was one of the things that we did, was helping people come together. I realized, though, as I became a lawyer and actually started working in the field, most of the legal system is not based on that. It's based on who has the best argument. And I wanted no part of that.
Yeah.
I want no part of that at all. I want to bring people together. Still, the Star Trek mentality is working here. And so when I started my own law firm, my immediate question to myself was, how can I, now that I'm out doing my own thing, actually bring people together? And the answer that I got was, help families come together, especially people thinking about their end-of-life decisions and gathering their support team around them, who they want to help them if they are ever in a situation where they become ill and they can't manage their affairs, or if, upon their death, who do they want to help them and support them, and how can I use the law to allow that to happen? And so that's how I am working to use the law for healing and bringing people together rather than winning an argument.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. I value the law a great deal, and I'm not an attorney or anything like that, but I have worked in the world of legislation, and I've worked in the world of dealing with helping to get legislation passed and interacting with lawyers. And my wife and I worked with an attorney to set up our trust, and then couple of years ago, I redid it after she passed away. And so I think that there was a lot of work that attorneys do that is extremely important. Yeah, there are attorneys who are always dealing with the best arguments. And probably for me, the most vivid example of that, because it was so captivating when it happened, was the whole OJ trial back in the 1990s, we were at a county fair and we had left going home and turn on the radio only to hear that the police were following OJ and they finally arrested him. And then when the trial occurred, I was working at a company and had a radio, and people would come around, and we just had the radio on and followed the whole trial. And it was interesting to see all the manipulation and all the movement. And you're right, it came down to who had the best argument, right or wrong.
The bloody glove. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Yeah.
Yep, I remember that. I remember where I was when they arrested him, too. I was at my grandparents' house, and we were watching it on TV. My grandfather was captivated by the whole thing. But yes, there's certainly, some manipulation. There are also lawyers who do a lot of good and a lot of wonderful things. And in reality, most cases don't go to trial. They're settled in some way. And so, there isn't always, who has the best argument. It's not always about that.
Right.
And at the same time, that is, what the system is based on to some extent. And really, when our country was founded, our founding fathers were a bunch of acted in a lot of ways like a bunch of children. If you read books on, the Constitution, it was all about, I want this in here and I want that in here. And, a lot of argument around that, which of course is to be expected. And many of them did not expect our country's government to last beyond their lifetimes. James Madison was the exception, but all the others were like, it's going to fail. And yet, I am very, very proud to be a lawyer in this country, because while it's not perfect, our founding documents actually have a lot of flexibility and can be interpreted to fit modern times, which is, I think, the beauty of them and exactly what the founders intended for them.
Yeah, and I do think that some people are taking advantage of that and causing some challenges, but that's also part of our country and part of our government. I like something Jimmy Carter once said, which was, we must adjust to changing times while holding to unwavering principles. And I think that's the part that I think sometimes is occasionally being lost, that we forget those principles, or we want to manipulate the principles and make them something that they're not. But he was absolutely right. That is what we need to do. And we can adjust to changing times without sacrificing principles.
Absolutely. I firmly believe that. And I would like to kind of turn it back to what we were talking about before, because you actually asked me, what are some challenges that I have faced? And if it's okay with you, I would like to get back to that.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Well, so I have faced some challenges. To a large extent, though, I was very well accommodated. I mean, the one challenge with the books, that was challenging. When I took the bar exam, oh, horror of horrors, it was a multiple shot deal, but it finally got done. However, it was not, my failing to pass the first time or times was not the fault of the actual Board of Law Examiners. They were very accommodating. I had to advocate for myself a little bit, and I also had to jump through some hoops. For example, I had to bring my own person to bubble in my responses on the multiple choice part, and bring my own person in to kind of monitor me while I did the essay portion. But they allowed me to have a computer. They allowed me to have, the screen reader. They allowed me to have time and a half to do the exam. And so we're accommodating in that way. And so no real challenges there, some hoops to jump through, but it got all worked out.
But even so, some of that came about because blind people actually had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get the Bar Association to recognize that those things needed to be that way.
Absolutely. And so, I was lucky to come into this at a time where that had already been kind of like pre-done for me. I didn't have to deal with that as a challenge. And so The only other challenges I had, some of them were mine, like, who's going to want to hire this blind person? I had a little bit of, kind of challenge there with that mindset issue for a while there. And I did have some challenges when I was looking for employment after I'd worked for legal aid for a while and I wanted to move on and do something else. And I knew I didn't want to work for a big firm. And I was talking to some small law firms about hiring me, small to mid-sized firms. And I would get the question of, well, you're blind, so what kind of accommodations do you need? And we would talk about, computer, special software to make it talk, those kinds of things. And it always ended up that, someone else was hired. And I don't have proof that the blindness and the hesitancy around hiring a disabled person or a blind person was in back of that decision. And at the same time, I had the sense that there was some hesitation there as well. So that, was a bit of a challenge. And starting my own law firm was its own challenge because I had to experiment with several different software systems to find one that was accessible enough for me to use. And the system I'm thinking about in particular, I wouldn't use any other system. And yet I'm using practically the most expensive estate planning drafting system out there because it happens to be the most accessible. It's also the most expensive.
Well, there's always that.
There's always that. And
what's it called? I'm curious.
It's called Wealth Counsel.
Okay.
Wealth, and then the word counsels.
Counsel, yeah.
SEL. And it's wonderful. And the folks there are very responsive. If I say something's not accessible, I mean, they have fixed things for me in the past.
Isn't that great?
Call and complain. Isn't that wonderful? It is wonderful. And that's awesome. I had a CRM experience with a couple of different like legal CRM software, and I used one for a while and it was okay. But then, everyone else said this other one was better and it was actually less accessible. So I went back to the previous one, so I have to do a lot of my own testing, which is kind of a challenge in and of itself. I don't have people testing software for me. I have to experiment and test, and in some cases pay for something for a while before I realize it's not, not worth it. But now I have those challenges pretty much ironed out. And I have a paralegal who helps me do some things that, like, she proofreads my documents, for instance, because otherwise there may be formatting things that I miss. And so I have the ability to have sighted assistance with things that I can't necessarily do myself, which is, absolutely fine.
Yeah. Now, do you use Lexis? Is it accessible?
I don't need LexisNexis.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a member of the bar association of my state bar association, which is not voluntary. It's mandatory, but I'm a member primarily because they have a legal search engine that they work with that we get for free. I mean, with our membership.
There you go.
So there you go. So I don't need Lexis or Westlaw or any of those other search engines for what I do. And if I was like really into litigation and going to court all the time and really doing deep research, I would need that, but I don't. I can use the one that they have that we can use. So, and it's a entirely web-based system. It's fairly accessible.
Well, and that makes it easier to, as long as you've got people's ears,
absolutely,
to make it accessible, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it certainly does.
Well, so do you regard yourself as a resilient person? Has blindness impacted that or helped make that kind of more the case for you, do you think?
I do.
Resilience is such an overused term, but it's fair to question to ask.
I mean, resilience is, to my mind, a resilient person is able to face challenges with a relatively positive outlook, and view a challenge as something to be worked through rather than overcome. And So yes, I do believe that blindness in and of itself has allowed me to find ways to adapt to situations and pivot in cases where, I need to find an alternative to using a mouse, for instance.
Yeah.
How would I do that? And so in other areas of life, I am, because I'm blind, I'm able to more easily pivot into finding alternative solutions. I do believe that it has made me more resilient.
Do you
In that
think that
way.
being blind has caused you, and this is an individual thing because I think that there are those who don't, but do you think
Mm-hmm.
that it's caused you to learn to listen better?
That's a good question because I have a lot of sighted friends. And one of the things that people just assume is that, wow, you must be a really good listener. Well, my husband would tell you that's not always the case.
Yeah, my wife said
Just,
the same thing. Yeah.
like everyone else, sometimes I hear what I want to hear
Hmm.
in a conversation. And at the same time, one of the things that I do tell people is that because I'm blind, I do rely on other senses more, primarily hearing, I would say, and that hearing provides a lot of cues for me about my environment, and I've learned to be more skillful at it. So I would say that yes, I am a good listener in terms of my environment, very sensitive to that in my environment. In terms of active listening to conversations and being able to listen to what's behind what people say, which is another aspect of listening. I think that is a skill that I've developed over time with conscious effort. I
Yeah.
don't think I'm any better of a quote unquote listener than anybody else if I hadn't developed that primarily in my mediation when I was doing that. That was a huge thing for us was to be able to listen not actually to what people were saying, but what was behind what people were saying.
Right.
And so I really consciously developed that skill during those years and took it with me into my legal practice, which is why I am very, why I very much stress that I'm not only an attorney, but I'm also a counselor at law. That doesn't mean I'm a therapist, but it does mean I
Right.
listen to what people say so that, and what's behind what people say, so that with the ear towards providing them the legal solution that meets their needs as they describe them in their words.
Well, I think for me, um, I learned to listen, but it is an exercise, and it is something that you need to practice. And maybe I learned to do it a little bit better because I was blind. For example,
Mm-hmm.
I learned to ride a bike, and you have to learn to listen to what's going on around you so you don't crash into cars.
Oh,
But
I'd fall on my face. Um,
yeah, you could do it. But what I really did was when I was working at a company and was told that the job was going to be phased out because I wasn't a revenue producer and the company was an engineering startup and had to bring in more revenue producers.
mm-hmm.
And I was given the choice of going away or going into sales, which I had never done. And as I love to tell people, I lowered my standards and went from science to sales. But the reality is that I think I've always, and I think we all always sell in one way or another. But I also knew what the unemployment rate among employable blind people was and is. Yeah. And so I went into sales with no qualms. But there I really learned to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And and it was really a matter of learning to well, not just listen, but really learning to communicate with the people you work with. And I think that I won't say blindness made me better, but what it did for me was it made me use the technologies like the telephone perhaps more than some other people. And I did learn to listen better because I worked at it, not because I was blind, although they're related, of
Exactly.
course.
Yeah, and I would say I would 100% agree. I worked at it. I mean, even when I was a child, I worked at listening to become better at kind of like analyzing my environment based on sounds that were in it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known. I mean, it's not a natural gift, as some people assume.
Yeah.
It's something you practice and you have to work at. You get to work at.
Well, as I point out, there are people like SEAL Team 6, the Navy SEALs, and the Army Rangers, and so on, who also practice using all of their senses, and they learn in general to become better at listening and other kinds of skills because they have to survive. But that's what we all do. Is if we do it right, we're learning it. It's not something that's just naturally there.
Right. I agree.
Which I think is important. So you're working in a lot of estate planning and so on. And I mentioned earlier that it was back in 1995, we originally got one, and then it's now been updated, but we have a trust. What's the difference between having like a trust and a will?
Well, that's interesting that you should ask. So a will is the minimum that pretty much I would say everyone needs, even though 67% of people don't have one in the US. And it is pretty much what everyone needs. And it basically says, you know, I'm a person of sound mind, and I know who is important to me and what I have that's important to me. And I want it to go to these people who are important to me. And by the way, I want this other person to manage things after my death. They're also important to me. And a trust, basically, there are multiple different kinds of trusts, huge numbers of different kinds. And the trust that you probably are referring to takes the will to kind of another level and provides more direction about how to handle property and how it's to be dealt with, not only after death, but also during your lifetime. And trusts are relatively, most of them, like I said, there are different kinds, but they can be relatively flexible, and you can give more direction about how to handle that property than you can in a will. Like, for instance, if you made an estate plan and your kids were young, well, I don't want my children to have access to this property until they're responsible adults. So maybe saying in a trust until they're age 25, you can do that. Whereas in a will, it's more difficult to do that.
And a will, as I understand it, is a lot more easily contested than a trust.
You know, it does depend, but yes, it is easily contested. That's not to say that if you have a trust, you don't need a will, which is a misconception that some people have.
Yeah, we have a will in our trust.
Right. And so, you know, you need the will for the court. Not everyone needs a trust. I would also venture to say that if you don't have a will on your death, the law has ideas about how your property should be distributed. So if you don't have a will, you know, your property is not automatically going to go to the government as unclaimed. But if you don't have powers of attorney for your healthcare and your finance to help you out while you're alive, you run the risk of a judge appointing someone you would not want to make your healthcare and financial decisions. And so I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but I do feel very strongly about this. Even blind people and disabled people who are, what did you call it earlier? The employable blind community, but maybe they're not employed. They don't have a lot of unemployed.
The unemployed.
The unemployed.
Employable blind people who
employable
are unemployed.
Blind people. Yes. You know, maybe they're not employed. They're on a government benefit. They don't have a lot of assets. Maybe they don't necessarily need that will. They don't have to have it. And at the same time, if they don't have those documents that allow people to manage their affairs during their lifetime, who's going to do it?
Yeah.
Who's going to do that?
Yeah.
You're giving up control of your body,
right,
potentially to someone you would not want, just because you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't need a will and nothing's going to happen to me. You're giving control of your body, perhaps to someone you don't want. You're not taking charge of your life. And you are allowing doctors and hospitals and banks to perpetuate the belief that you are not an independent person.
Right.
I'm very passionate about it. excuse me, I'll get off my soapbox now.
That's okay.
Those are, and to a large extent, those power of attorney forms are free. You can download them from your state's website. Um, they're minimalistic. They're definitely, I don't use them because I don't like them for my state, but you can use them, and you can have someone help you fill them out. You could sign them, and then look, you've made a decision about who's going to help you when you're not able to help yourself.
Which is extremely important to do. And as I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, we went all the way and have a trust, and we've funded the trust, and everything is in the trust. But I think that is a better way to keep everything protected.
Mm-hmm.
And it does provide so much more direction for whoever becomes involved when you decide to go elsewhere than, as they put it, this mortal coil.
Yes,
I assume that the coil is mortal. I don't know.
I
But anyway,
assume.
yeah, who knows?
And, trusts are good for, they're not just for the uber wealthy, which
Mm-mm.
is another misconception. Trusts do some really good things. They keep your situation, they keep everything more or less private. Like, I said you need a will for the court. Well, the court has the will, and it most of the time, if you have a trust, it just says, I want my stuff to go into the Michael Hingson Trust. I'm making that up, by the way. And my trust just deals with the distribution.
Yeah.
And so stuff doesn't get held up in court. The court doesn't have to know about all the assets that you own. It's not all public record. And that's a huge, some people care. They
Yeah.
don't want everyone to know their business. And when I tell people, I can go on eCourts today and pull up the estate of anyone that I want in North Carolina and find out what they owned if they didn't have a will or if they just had a will. And people
Mm-hmm.
are like, really? You can do that? Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't need any fancy credentials. It's all a matter of public record. And if you have a trust, that does not get put into the court record unless it's litigated, which, it does happen, but
Yeah.
not often.
But again, I think that, yeah, and I'm not one of those uber wealthy people, but I
Mm-hmm.
have a house. We
Mm-hmm.
we used to have a wheelchair accessible van for Karen. I
Mm-hmm.
still have a car, so that when I need to be driven somewhere rather than using somebody else's vehicle, we use this. And those are probably the two biggest assets. Although I have a bank account with some in it, not a lot, not nearly as much as Jack Benny anyway. But anyway, the bottom line is, yeah, but the bottom line is that I think that the trust keeps everything a lot cleaner, and it makes perfect
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Yep, it does.
And I didn't even have to go to my general law firm that I usually use, Dewey, Cheatham, Good and Howe. So it worked out really well. Hey, I watched the Marx Brothers.
Oh,
What can I say?
you watch the Marx Brothers, of course.
Well, I want to thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm glad that we did it, and that we also got to talk
Absolutely.
about the whole issue of wills and trusts and so on, which is, I think, important. Is there any last things that you'd like to say to people? And also, do you work with clients across the country or just in North Carolina?
So I work with clients in North Carolina. I will say that. And one last thing that I would like to say to people
Mm-hmm.
is that it's really important to build your support team, whether you're blind, have another disability, you need people to help you out on a day-to-day basis, or you decide that you want people to help you out if you're unable to manage your affairs at some point in your life. It's very important to build that support team around you. And there is nothing wrong. You can be self-reliant and still have people on your team
Yes.
to be there for you. And that is very important. And there's absolutely no shame, and you're not relinquishing your independence by
Mm-mm.
doing that. So today, I encourage everyone to start thinking about who's on your team. Do you want them on your team? Do you want different people on your team? And create a support team, however that looks like, whatever that looks like for you, that has people on it that you know, love, and trust.
Everybody should have a support team. I think there is no question, at least in my mind, about that. So good point. Well, if people want to maybe reach out to you, how do they do that?
Sure. So I am on the interwebs at erinedgarlegal.com. That's my website where you can learn more about my law firm and all the things that I do.
And Erin is Erin,
Yes.
just say that. Edgar,
And
E-D-G-A-R.
Edgar is like Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
Hopefully less scary. And you can find the contact information for me on the website. By Facebook, you can find me on Facebook occasionally as Erin Baker Edgar, 3 separate words. That is my personal profile, or you can, and Michael will have in the show notes the company page for my law firm as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, and I want to thank all of you for listening. This has been a fun episode. It's been great to have Erin on. Love to hear your thoughts out there who have been listening to this today. Please let us know what you think. You're welcome to email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com, michaelhi@accessibe.com, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. Wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star rating. We really appreciate getting good ratings from people and reading and getting to know what you think. If you know anyone who you think might be a good guest, you know some people you think ought to come on Unstoppable Mindset, Erin, of course, you as well. We would appreciate it if you'd give us an introduction, because we're always looking for more people to have come on and help us show everyone that we're all more unstoppable than we think we are. And that's really what it's all about and what we want to do on the podcast. So hope that you'll all do that. And in the meanwhile, with all that, Erin, I want to thank you once more for being here and being with us today. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Michael. I very much enjoyed it.